So be it. Okay. So be it.
As well, you think?
I don't know. Maybe.
Yeah. I think the Wi-Fi network.
Good question. So here, if we do this,
You gotta be careful with that. Record yourself while you're up to things, you know.
you're not kidding.
Yeah.
You are not kidding. Or at least, I don't want to, luckily I'm in front of you guys, I wouldn't be picking my nose or anything like that. So if we do this, right, then we can handle this. Now, we don't have a controller at this point. We could go in here and if we wanted to set this up as a controller, if we wanted to, we could do an inline controller here, which is fine. But we could also go over here and say that we're going to have a, let's say under playlist, let's say new control .js, and I'll go in here and I'll say juke controller, and I'll give this the name, which is going to be new playlist control. And let me actually just go back here to my index. So this is going to be under playlist, new CTRL. I should end up getting that. And that's going to give me the ability to go over here and say controller is new playlist CTRL. Again, if that doesn't give me any errors, which it doesn't, I don't have any save method, so nothing is getting called here. But again, taking this one step at a time, we could go now and start working on this controller over here. So this controller is going to have a scope that we could inject into it, and we'll say scope.save equals a function. And I'm just going to console.log out scope.playlist, right? And that should give me the name of the playlist that I'm creating. So let me go back here. And I'll go to save this. And I'll see that that gives me the playlist that I'm looking for. What I would like to have is I would like to have some method that's going to allow me to create a playlist. So what I would like to have is some sort of playlist factory here. And what I would like to be able to do is to tell the playlist factory to create scope.playlist, and would like to get something back, which is going to be the playlist that got created. So we could go over here and put in, hey, look, here's the playlist that got created, console.log playlist. Again, this is a little bit more code than I would probably write in terms of doing this, but sort of have to get through this. So I'll go ahead and do it. Now, again, error messages are friends here, okay? We don't have this provider. I think you might be right on the speed. Maybe not, I don't know, can't tell. So let's actually add this in. And so we'll go over here, and I'm gonna go over here and I'm gonna add a factory JS here. And this is gonna be a juke controller, juke factory playlist factory. The only requirement for a factory is what? That you return something. Okay. Again, we'll end up getting a different message here, but let me go back to my index page, and this is going to be my factory. again, assuming I have only one factory for each of these sort of entities in my application, I don't mind this sort of naming convention. It makes it a little bit easier for me to worry about what I ended up calling this thing, but I don't know, there might be some opinions on it one way or the other. Again, I could look at the path and know that it's the playlist factory. So let me go over here, and I shouldn't get any errors here, but if I went to do that, right, I'm gonna get an error because I don't have a create method. So let's go out, build out that factory method. So let's go back here. Here's our factory. We know we're going to need HTTP. And what we're going to do here is we're going to have a create method, which is going to be a function. And we're going to use, and don't forget, we're passing in here our playlist. And we'll say HTTP. And this is going to be a post. We're going to post to API playlists, and we're going to pass the playlist. Again, this is the nice thing about, I think, what you're seeing here is without having to even go in and look at the API, it's a RESTful API. And it's going with this pattern of saying, hey, look, you want to insert something new? You're going to do a post, API, whatever the entity is, plural, playlists, okay? So it allows you to do things like editing, inserting, and fetching, and that sort of thing fairly easily, okay? So once we end up doing that, we could go over here, and we know that we're going to get some data back. And we could return our result.data, which should be our playlist. Now, again, common problem here is that we expect create to return a promise, so don't forget to return. Okay? And so now if we end up going back here, this is on our controller. Right? This should end up calling to see whether or not this is going to work for us. Save. Okay. We've got a playlist with an ID. Okay. At this point, we might want to go in here and just open up Mongo. Okay, just to look at this. Again, this is a lot of the back-end stuff is black box, right? There's actually some complicated Mongo stuff that's going on. I don't use Mongo in a production at work. Some things I am totally unaware of that you could look at, Mongo plugins and that sort of thing. So this is probably a pretty good repository to have. If you start using Mongo and to do more complicated things, you could go back and look and see how some of this is done here. But if I go show collections here, I could say DB playlists, find, and I'll see that here is my playlist. These are actually some playlists that already exist because I've been modifying my database. That's why you see some songs added to the playlist. Let's actually fix that up. Remove. He's going to remove them all. It's terrible. Okay. But let's add this back in. And so here's our playlist with a name. Notice it's got a collection of artists and songs. I think we're just going to end up adding songs for this workshop, or at least that's what we'll probably end up getting to here. So now that we end up having some playlists, the other thing that we want to do is we want to end up displaying the playlists over here on the left-hand side. So let's start thinking about how we're going to end up building out that functionality, okay? So what I'm going to do here, in order to do that, we know that this is going to be in our nav bar here on the side. again, as you're going through this, okay, one of the things that you want to do on a regular basis is end up committing your changes to the repository. So you can end up backing up if something ends up getting broken. We could do that here. This is a little bit different because, again, this is inside of this other giant repo. But again, you could end up pulling it out if you want to and doing that. So here what I'm going to do is I'm going to go to my sidebar, which is actually my index file. And we'll go up here a bit. And here's our playlist. So what I want to do is I want to have an unordered list. I'm going to give this an ng controller playlist CTRL. And what I'm going to be hoping for here is that I have this list item, ng repeat, list in playlist, and for starters, I want to show the playlist. Again, errors are great because we'll get an error here that this playlist control doesn't exist. So I'm going to go over here. I'm going to break with my convention a little bit. This is going to be playlist control.js. And I'm going to say juke controller playlist CTRL function. Make that error go away. And let's go over to our index page. And let's go over here and add that in. Playlist, and this is going to be playlist control. Can you wish there was a way that you could loop through all of your files inside of that folder and not have to do this? Well, there is, but it was a little bit more complicated than it had to be. But eventually I'll show you that there's used to do that. But now if we do this, make that error go away. Okay, so what we really want to do here is that in our controller, here's our new control, here's our playlist control. What we want to do here is in our playlist factory, we want to have playlist factory fetch, and we want to get a collection of playlists back here. And we want to be able to basically say scope, which we'll have to inject here, playlists equals playlists. Of course, we do that, we get an error, right? That fetch doesn't exist. So let's go back to our factory. And again, since this is nice and RESTful, I don't know why I called it playlist. This is going to be fetch. You guys see the beauty of the RESTful API, why I keep on, even in those simple projects, make things RESTful, right? It's going to make your life a lot easier when you have to start calling these methods. So here we're going to do an HTTP GET. We're not passing anything. And we're going to get a result. We're going to return it. So here's our playlist. Let's just fix our fix this up a little bit. So we've got our, by the way, you notice this file is getting bigger and bigger. It's getting a little annoying to work with. When we look at directives, we'll be able to pull these things out into separate files. So let's go over here and let's actually just put my class here. This is going to be a class of list group. This is going to be a class of list group item. So let's reload this guy. That looks a little bit better. Right? Everybody happy? It's great, right? This is great. Right? Except it's not so great. Right? Because we really want this to show up here on our menu bar. Now, there's two different things that you could end up using to accomplish this. One thing you could do is you could end up using Angular copy. I'm going to show you what I think is a little bit of a simpler way to do it. You could do either one of these things. What I'm going to do here is that, and the key here, factories, this is the big takeaway, that these factories are only run once. They have state. So what I'm going to do is inside of my factory, before I return anything, okay, I'm going to say playlist equals empty string. Okay. And this is really what I'm going to end up returning here. So what I could end up doing here, if I want to not have to do the Angular copy here, is that when I end up getting these results back, think of a simple way to do this. The way that I ended up doing this was that I'm going to put this inside of, so this is going to be playlist equals my result dot data. Now, the key here is that the way that I ended up doing this, and there might be a bit of a simpler way to do it, is to, when I end up going into here, I end up saying, just think about this for a moment. So I have this fetch. I'm going to put this method called getList here. Which is going to return my playlist. And then I'm going to go over here, and I'm going to say every time that I go to call fetch, I'm going to end up attaching this to playlists. And what I could end up doing here is that when I end up going to create something, I could say, so when we create it, we want to end up getting this back. Let's just give this a little bit of thought. So if I go to fetch, this is going to be in this playlist. So one of the things that I could do here, this is, I'm going to say playlist.push result.data. And when this thing ends up loading here, let me break this out. So much for simplifying Angular copy. Let me pop something up. Okay. Here's my browser. Here's my playlist. Here's my factory. Okay. So what I ended up doing here is that actually instead of, I have this method called playlist, which returns this playlist. And instead of actually having a fetch method, I actually call this when this module ends up loading. So let's actually go back. Sorry about that. So what I'm going to do here is I'm going to go over here, and instead of having this fetch method, I'm going to put this up here. And this is going to get called when this module ends up loading. So I'm going to have a copy of my playlists that are in memory. I'm going to end up pushing to the playlist. And this method is going to end up calling getLists. Okay?
What's over the two returns?
This shouldn't be returned. Sorry about that. So this module is going to load. It's going to make an HTTP request. Assuming I'm going to need my playlist, it's going to get the existing playlist. It's going to put it in underscore playlist. When I call getList, it's going to end up giving me this value back. So I'm actually not going to have a fetch method that I'm going to call, but inside, instead of in my playlist controller, let's call this getPlaylist. And if I go inside here, I'm going to say that now this is not going to solve my problem yet. But what I'm going to do here is for my playlists in my scope. Yeah.
So could you have done just what you did, but left that as a function and just called it from the controller when the controller gets initialized, so that you could call it again in case you needed to refresh?
Maybe. But let's do this here. What I'm going to do here is I'm going to say, I'm going to change things a little bit. I'm going to say scope.playlist, okay, is a function. And it's going to return, what it's going to return is playlist factory at playlist. Okay? So again, we can see now this is a method. When this method gets called, it's going to end up getting the playlist. Now the fact that it's a method, okay, if I now end up going into my index page, and instead of actually going here and saying in playlist, but actually in playlist, what happens is that when there's a digest cycle, which happens, okay, when that HTTP request is completed, when there's a digest cycle, okay, it'll go and it'll run this function again to see if anything ended up changing, okay? And it'll find out that something ended up changing. It'll end up getting the new playlist, okay? And in fact, this will hopefully add these over here. So now I've got this one. And you could see that if I scroll down, this got added as well. So the big takeaway here is that if you have a method that's getting data, okay? You have a method that's getting data, it'll go, your scope is smart enough to say, hey, look, here's this method that was called to get this data, okay? It'll end up calling it on a digest cycle to see if that ended up changing.
The digest cycle, I assume, runs pretty often, right?
When do you think it runs? You think there's a timer in the background?
Sure, to be honest with you. I would say it runs pretty often because you want it to refresh the page more or less, right?
Think it's running now?
Yeah.
You think so?
Well, I guess anytime anything runs, that's when it triggers.
What might trigger it?
Does it monitor, I mean, is Angular smart and monitors the variables, whether or not they're changing?
What it's really monitoring, it's a great question, John. okay? But it's not that magical, okay? When there's any sort of user interaction, that's when the digest cycle is gonna run. It'll actually run through until things are sort of stabilized. It'll run through a couple of times. And if it sees that sort of running the digest cycle changes things, every time it ends up going through, you'll end up getting an error, okay? It'll say, hey, look, I can't do this. I'm done, okay? It should be a stable digest cycle, okay? So it runs here, it ends up calling this method. It sees that this thing ends up changing, and maybe it'll end up running through it again. Again, this is all under the covers. But there are certain calls that trigger the digest cycle too. So a click triggers a digest cycle, but also the return of a HTTP request will trigger it as well and cause the digest cycle to run.
The reason I ask is if you do something where you're going to a function, it's a really complicated function, maybe you might want to add some logic in certain cases not to run the rest of the function.
Right, but we know that this is not a complicated function, so it works out well. So this is just one way that you could end up storing this so that you could do this other than the Angular copy. The solution that's going to be up there is the official solution. That's got the Angular copy. I started out with this one, it worked, so I just want to show you another option.
So, how would this work if there's an error when you made the post request for that?
Yeah, I mean, basically, you could put a catch in, and you could end up catching that error. So the error, it depends on, I mean, I think the one sort of takeaway here is that I wouldn't end up, and again, you could look at the official solution, we'll have some logic there for the error handling, but what I would say is that, and it's a good question, is that you don't really want to put your error handling here. You really want to put it in your controller because your controller is the one that's going to handle that error. Your controller is the one that has the interaction with the view, so let your controller put a catch in your controller to catch that error.
But so let's say you posted something from that widget on the thing there, and then the result.data that comes back at the factory level, right, is some kind of bad put or a post or whatever. It's like you can't post that data.
So you think that if there was bad data that came back from the post here, you would make it in here?
I don't know. I mean, the result.data, what would result?
When does then get called? When something is successful or unsuccessful?
I guess it's only successful.
Right.
So then it would just roll down to a catch,
Which we don't have, but if we wanted to go back over here, right, and we wanted to, in our new control, right, nothing would prevent us from putting a catch here and catching that error and maybe displaying it or logging it out or something along those lines, right? It's very, very important to realize that, right? If, in fact, you're sending back a 200 for something that you consider to be unsuccessful on the server, you're making a mistake, right? You want to make sure, that's why those status codes become important, because Angular is looking at those status codes to determine what it considers to be successful and unsuccessful. Chris, you had a question?
Yeah, so when we started working on Angular, and we saw this with the Northern apps that we've been working on weekends and stuff, part of the benefit of it was that whenever you created something, it just showed up on the screen. It was beautiful, it was simple. Why isn't it this way?
It's a great question. I mean, the problem is there's a couple of different ways that you could solve this problem. Okay? I mean, if we really wanted to, and I don't necessarily say it's the worst thing in the world to do. I mean, one thing we know is that if we are always looking at that same collection, right, we're going to be in pretty good shape, right? If we're always looking at the, one thing we're doing in our factory is we are just dealing with one collection, okay, which really is the same thing that you're doing with Angular copy. It's the same thing, okay? The reason why you didn't see it before is that everything was happening within our controller, okay? We had control over it, okay? It was within our controller. Now, if there are other ways to work around that. Now we've got two separate controllers. Now we have this idea of how do we communicate between controllers, okay? Which is not an easy thing to accomplish. The way that you would communicate through controllers is either, and we're doing it sometimes, right? We're doing it with our player factory. It's something we use to communicate between controllers. We could also, if we wanted to, we could do a broadcast and say, by the way, Playlists have changed. If you care about that, go fetch it. Okay?
So the reason for that is because there's different controllers for adding a playlist and for the sidebar.
That's exactly right. They're two different controllers.
So the adding the playlist is running a digest cycle, but
The playlist doesn't know about it. Right. I mean, if basically we basically said, hey, look, we're going to fetch these items. It doesn't see any correlation between the two of them. But now if we end up putting this in a method, okay, and there might be a simpler way for me to do this, but not on the spot. But that's sort of the general idea that you're looking at the same object. But if you run into that problem, just realize, hey, look, these are two different things. How do I end up communicating with them? Again, you might start out with maybe some broadcast or something like that on the root scope, but then find out if there's a better way to make that communication. Okay.
In terms of structure and laying out something, I guess it could just be the developer's preference. Could you have kind of like one controller that just handles, it's almost like a data box, it's like anything that might be, any data that might be common among things, it would just be like, it's got a data object in there and a setter and a getter.
Mm-hmm.
And then that could be one controller, and then you can have as many other controllers that you want. They would just kind of refer back to that.
That's factory.
That's factory. That's what the problem is.
Yeah,
You could do that, but you would never do it in a
what
controller.
I meant was a factory.
Yes.
What the central factory.
Absolutely.
Data.
Absolutely.
Other factories and other controllers just kind of look.
If you have to have that kind of communication, that's perfectly legitimate to do.
Were you gonna say something like you wouldn't do? Because I do that. Were you just about to say you shouldn't do that?
No, I don't think there's anything necessarily wrong with it. You know what? It's if you need it. Here we have something that we need to do. Again, there might be a more elegant solution to do it, but there's a couple of different ways to skin a cat. Yeah, terrible expression.
It's perfectly legitimate to use this as kind of global variables.
It's not a global variable.
Well, not really,
It's a factory.
It's a factory, but like I have like a globals object, right?
That's
And
bad.
Well, no. What I'm saying is, but I stick things in it. Like if I have 4 controllers that need to all know about the number of people. And
Yeah.
And I'll get it once and I'll set it there. But I might modify it, or if I want to go to the next controller, I just inject it. It's kind of, I mean,
You're describing the same thing. It's just a factory, right? Again, the bottom line is that when we think about factories, let's think about two different things, right? Factories allow us to reuse code, okay? But there's another big benefit of factories. They also get us to store state, okay? So let's actually go and start displaying our playlist. And again, sort of one step at a time here. By the way, this whole idea of the playlist not showing on the right, that would be a bug that you would end up fixing. Hey, look, it was a feature, add a playlist. You never told me I had to display it, Maybe I'll have them click a button. Hey, are there any new playlists? And I'll make you click it. So again, these are sort of, we can maybe say they're two different features. Or if it was spelled out, hey, look, this thing needs to update, then obviously you want to get both those things done. So now let's actually go and say that what we want to do is we want to, and I'm going to keep a little track of time here. We want to go over here and we want to actually get to that playlist. So here's our playlist. Let's actually put this in a link. We'll say UI sref, and we're going to have a state called playlist, and we want to pass in an ID, which is going to be the ID of the playlist. So this is a state that we want to have that doesn't yet exist. We don't know about it yet until we end up clicking on this, but it tells us clearly this is not a state that you have created, in which case we're going to go and we're going to end up adding that state. So the way that I'm going to end up adding that state is, again, sort of moving this one level at a time here. I'm going to take this out. I'm going to take this out. And this is going to be playlist ID. And the state is going to be playlist. Okay? So if I do that, that should make that error go away. and should load nothing. Again, you see that whole idea of Angular is complicated. So do things in small pieces with it. You get this to go away, then you could go in here. I mean, at this point, we're pretty confident that we could load something up here. And let's go over here, and this is going to be templates, and we'll call this list. And we'll go over here, and we'll create this. .html. And if we rerun this, here's our list that's showing up here. Now, what we want to do here is we want to have our playlist, and we want to be able to basically add songs to our playlist, okay? But one thing that we also want to be able to do is we want to give the user the ability to choose songs, okay? So making it over here, we want to do something like add song. And this is going to be a, we're going to want to have a select object. And we're going to use something called ng options, which doesn't exist yet. But the way that this ends up reading, we know that we could do a repeat, right? If we have on our scope song, song, and songs, and we'll say song.name or song and song. So this will be what we'll end up displaying for the song. Now, this doesn't exist yet. We're going to end up needing to put it in. Let's give this a class so it looks okay. At least we should get a drop down that show up. One of the things that happens with a select object in your options, you need to have an ng model. It's a requirement, okay, on that directive. Talk about directives. We're not going to get that into it. It gets to be a little bit complicated. But we're going to do an ng model, and our ng model is going to be song to add. Doesn't exist yet, and we don't have any options, but we'll get there eventually. Okay, so nothing is showing up here, which is okay, I guess. And let's go over here and let's just, this drives me a little crazy, and let's give this a class of, well, let's do this. And now this will look a little bit better, but we're going to want to have some button here. So we'll have a button, ng click, or excuse me, button type is submit. It'll automatically call that ng submit. It doesn't exist yet. And let's give this a class of btn primary. Okay, so now let's figure out how to get our songs in there. And for this, what we're going to do is if we go back to our states, right, we have our template. Let's also say that we have a controller, and this is going to be our playlist control. Right, not playlist, but playlist. We did this. Why does it think we have a playlist control? It's a little bit weird. This is a bad naming, right? It's not a playlist control. This is a playlist control. right? It's kind of annoying, but it's important. And so this is going to be playlist control. Let's go back here. You can see having something that would actually inject these would be pretty helpful at this point. And now here are our artists, but it's telling us playlist control is not a function. And the reason for that is here's our playlist control. Let's see why I'm not getting that. Playlist control. Let's go to our state. And this is going to be side of our index. So this is going to be playlist control, right? Not one playlist, but multiple playlists. Get that error to go away, but once we click on this, right, we don't have this playlist control, which is what I was getting at before. So let's create that. So this is going to be, and this is going to be our playlist control. Playlist control.
Quick question, is it a little bit hinky to put the templates in there with the JavaScript? Or I guess, is that just personal preference?
I think it's fine. I think it's fine, yeah. I think it's good because I think then you know where to look for them. By the way, if you ever see projects where sometimes they'll put every controller in a folder called controllers, every factory it's awful because you just can never find what you're looking for. So this is good because it's separating out the functionality. Sometimes it gets tricky to move things around, but that's the price you pay to find them pretty easily. Once we do that, we should be able to go up here, our playlist. What we want to be able to do here is get our songs that we're going to add. Okay, so now it's not breaking here, but what I really want to be able to do, ideally, is I want to be able, in my playlist control, ideally what would be nice would be to get my songs passed in there, to do a resolve. We haven't done a resolve yet. So it would be nice if, in fact, I could pass in my songs. Okay? You could pass in your songs if you end up using a resolve. We have a playlist ID, so now we want to find our songs. So if I just run this, I'll get an error, and it's the unknown provider error, right, which you should be very familiar with. You're going to get it sometimes when you want it, sometimes when you don't want it. Okay? So here it's actually looking for these songs here, and I can get that error to go away by simply going back to my states on my playlist, and I could specify not only that this is going to be my controller, but I could do a resolve, and resolve is going to take keys. And what I really want to get is all the songs, right, that I can add to the playlist. So if I just said songs, and I return an array, that error is going to go away. Now, that doesn't make a lot of sense. What I really want to be able to do is to say, hey, look, Song Factory, do me a favor, get me all my songs. Let's take a look at the Song Factory. So here's our song, here's our Song Factory. Unfortunately, our Song Factory doesn't have a method to get all the songs, okay? So if we wanted this to work, and luckily there's a catch here, but we could go back to our states over here. And we could inject our song factory, which is perfectly legitimate, and say return song factory fetch. Get us all of our songs. Doesn't exist. Luckily, and this is something that we looked at in the prior lecture. Luckily, there's some error handling when there's an error changing states that tells us, in fact, song factory.fetch is not a function. And this is something that I think is probably in the module.js file. You can take a look at it. If I didn't have that here, this would be an error that would disappear into the ether. Okay? So what I want to do here is actually, let's create that. So here's our song factory. And what I'm going to do, say fetch. And I want these to actually, whether or not I need these to need the audio URL is another story. I think I could probably just get away with, right? Again, this RESTful API is very helpful here. http.get API songs, then function return result.data.
And you could go ahead and if you needed to fit, fixed up or whatever, you could write in
I
there.
could. I don't think I need it here. Okay, so I'm gonna leave it off here. But if I do this, then let's see. I want to go back to my controller. Let me close some of these windows down here. It's getting a little crazy. So here's my states. Return song factory.fetch. Here's my playlist control. And so now if I have my songs, I could say scope.songs equals songs. And now I've got songs that I could end up adding to the playlist. Okay?
So when you did the resolve and you named it, the result of that songs, that's not the same as putting it on scope.songs, right?
Yeah, it's a very, very good if maybe you don't want it on the scope. Maybe you just want your controller to have it. I'm having that same feeling that they should automatically, why don't they just automatically put it on the scope? But scope exposes stuff to the view. But you might not want to expose to the view. Maybe you want to use it and do something else with it. Okay, maybe you want to use a subset of it.
So songs, when you define it in resolve, is just like a local variable to the controller.
That will get passed in and injected. It creates something that can be injected into the controller with that name.
And the thing is, if you keep it out of scope, right, it's not part of the digest cycle, right?
Yeah, I guess so, but I don't know if that would be the rationale for it. But I don't know.
Like, let's say it's a lot of data. Let's say it's 20,000 records.
Mm-hmm.
And if I put it on scope, sometimes, some Angular, when you put a lot of data in Angular, it really gets really slow.
Yeah, I have to tell you something. I've never put $20,000 records on the scope.
20,000, no.
20,000. I've never put 20,000 items on the scope. You might run into it, and then you're gonna have to investigate the digest cycle a little bit. I just haven't run into that.
I have.
Okay.
Yeah, I do it a lot.
All right.
Yeah. And if you try to repeat through something with 2,000 records, and you try to filter it, the thing just stops.
My advice would be probably don't repeat with 2,000 records.
That's right. You can't, really.
Right. At some point, it's gonna, you're gonna want to do paging or something along those lines, and just get what you want. Right.
It's
So-
like those big wings, big spoilers that people mount on a Honda Civic. You can do it, but you
You
should.
should.
Right. You've seen my car, I guess. So once we end up having this, let's actually go and we'll add to our, let's actually set this up. So we want to have some method, scope, add song, function song, console log song. And if we look at our template, right, here's our ng submit. I did that incorrectly. Add song, and let's actually go over here. We don't need to pass the song in here. We actually have on our model scope song to add, right? Now, we could go over here, and this is going to be the song that we're going to want to add to our playlist. So we could sort of wrap this up by saying we want our playlist factory to have a method called add song, scope song to add, and we'll see what we end up doing with the results, okay? But we want to actually set this up, and this should end up modifying our playlist. We'll see what ends up coming back. Again, treating this like a black box API. And this is actually where things also get a bit interesting, because this is actually a nested resource, okay? The song is getting posted to an existing playlist, okay? So what we can do here is this method doesn't exist. We could go back over here. This doesn't exist. Let's go back to our playlist factory. It's going to be over here. And we're going to have this method, which is going to be add song. So how's that going to work? Well, when we add song, okay, we're going to actually need, let's assume that we end up needing a playlist, okay? So we're going to pass in a playlist, and we're going to pass in a song. And I had to look into how the API was working, but basically the way that it's set up is that you can say HTTP, and I think it's a post. Let's make sure of that. /API playlists. Might be a put. Let me double check that. We're going to use the ID of the playlist. Okay? So we're going to use the ID of the playlist. And then, yeah, I think you're right. I think it is a put. We're modifying the playlist.
It would be a put if you don't include the playlist ID.
I think it was a post.
Yeah.
I think if you include the playlist ID, it's a post.
Let's,
Um,
no one remembers, huh?
I think it was a post.
Let's see, add song, post, okay? So there's a post, and I guess it's a post because you are, I guess that's semantic. We sort of spoke about this before too, I think when we were looking at Trip Planner, that it's a post because you're actually adding a song to the playlist, right? So this is our playlist ID, post, and this is going to be songs, and this is going to be song, is the song that we're posting. And for now, let's just look at our result. The other thing that we could also do here is that, let's look at what it doesn't like here. Here's our post to this guy.
Missing my plus sign.
Ah, thank you. This is where it would be nice to use the backticks, but it would be a way to find out if it's supported in the browser, which I don't think it is. Okay. And we're going to return this result.data. All right.
I think it is now. The new version coming.
Yeah, you just don't want to be in a position
No.
where someone doesn't have the new version, right?
Or have.
Right.
Right.
Right. So let's go over here and let's, before we do this, let's actually go to our states. Let's also resolve our playlist. We're going to have our playlist, and this is going to be our playlist factory. Let's have a method fetch by ID. How do we get the ID? Don't forget this playlist, when this route gets called, it's got an ID. So I use my state params, and I get its ID. So what I want to do is I want to end up resolving this playlist, and let's just add that in. And this is something is barking at me here. Try to figure that out. So this is going to be.
Can you just pass ID right in there to fetch ID?
Oh, yes. I'm sorry. This is a bad variable name, right? This is going to be state params. I can't pass it in here. I've got to use my state params. Now I've got my ID, and let's make that error going away. And so now at this point, our playlist factory, we're also going to have to inject in here. Let's go to our playlist factory. Let's get our fetch by ID. And this is going to be, going to pass in an ID, and we're going to say return $AT, and I just see an error on the next line too. This is going to be /API playlists, nice and restful. Result, return result dot data. Okay, and let's make sure I do this, even though we're not going to deal with that at the moment. So let me just make sure, trying to get back to doing one thing at a time. On my playlist control, I should be now grabbing a playlist here. I need, for a couple of reasons, I want to get the songs for the playlist. Let's just see if that works. So that didn't give me an error. That's a good sign. And let's actually go over here and say console.log playlist. There's my playlist, and we might as well, since we have a playlist, let's put it on the scope. Equals playlist. And let's go over here back to our template. And here's our list. And just for kicks, let's put a H2 here, playlist on name. So here's our playlist, and we want to be able to take something and add it. And so let's see if this works. We go to save, and we've got an internal error here. Let's see what it is. We've got a post.
I ran into this yesterday.
Yeah.
I think the route's looking for the entire playlist object in the body as well. That's the song. Not just the playlist ID.
Is that right?
It took me like 20 minutes to figure that out.
Let me see. I ran into something yesterday too, but let me just see if that's.
Because when you go to that route, it's not looking it up in the database with the ID. It's like looking for the actual playlist.
So here, when I ended up doing add song, here's my post. Let's see. I don't know, Joel. Let's see, because this seemed to work for me yesterday when I go to add a song. So when I go to my playlist factory, which is here. Yeah, I think here's my playlist. Maybe you're right. The other thing that sometimes happens with these is that there's actually modifications to these branches in between things, but I don't know, this looks similar, right? Post/songs. Song is equal to the song. Did I pass the song in? Let's just see if that's...
Is there an error on the server side? Right?
Yeah, let's take a look at that. So we always could go over here and look on our server. Line 32. It's just saying not found. So let me just make sure that we're passing in what we think we're passing in. So just as a quick thing to do, let's look at our playlist control. Yeah, I think my problem here is I'm not passing in the playlist, right? So here I want to add the song. I want to also add, and what do you do? Playlist or scope.playlist probably doesn't make all that much of a difference here. But if I do this, I think this will work.
Did you pass in the whole playlist or just the ID?
I'm passing in the playlist, but I'm just using the ID. So now if I do this, I think that'll work. I don't think I'm console logging anything, but let's check really quick. If we go to our Mongo, we can see if that song got added. And yes, it looks like we've got a song in here, which is good. Okay, so let's just do one other thing here. After we end up adding a song, let's just see what we get back here. I'm kind of curious whether this gives us just the song that got added. It would make sense if we're adding something that we would just get the song, but who knows? So this is just the song that's coming back here. So one thing we could do here is that we could end up, we want to say playlist, scope.playlist, songs, push, result, in which case we also, within our playlist, want to be able to go here and put something like an unordered list. And put a list item, class, list group item. And here, let's specify that we're going to do a repeat. And this is going to be ng repeat song in playlist songs. And just for starters, we could just say song.name. And so now we see the songs end up getting added, okay, which is good. If we want to add that play functionality to it, I think what we can do is do a little copying and pasting, something we're going to solve in the next workshop. But on our albums, let's say we've got this template for an album that's got this table. I could copy this, go back to my playlist, my list, paste this in, and this is going to be song in playlist.songs. Not quite. It's not going to quite work. And what we're going to end up doing here If we just did this part of it, so the problem that we're going to run into a couple of issues here. One of them being that we don't have any of our methods here, which we could end up copying as well. If we went back to look at our album and we looked at our album controllers, you would see that we have these three methods here, which eventually will go and distill out. Now, we go over here. Here's our playlist control. Again, that's why the naming becomes pretty important here. We could paste this in, and we could grab our player factory. Instead of scope album songs, this could be playlist songs. And there's one other thing that we need to do here. So one thing that's going to happen is that we haven't, you'll see that if I do this, this will show up, but nothing's going to end up playing. And the reason why nothing is going to be playing is that if you notice from my factory here, when I get a playlist by ID, I'm not doing anything, I'm not converting my songs so that I'm using my song factory. My song factory has a method which creates this audio URL. So what I want to do here is that in my playlist, in my factory, what I'm going to do is when I end up fetching by ID, I'll say result data.songs, and I could do this a couple of ways. I mean, simple way would be to do a for each, so it's converted. Let's say result data.songs equals result data.songs, and let's map it. Now we've got a song. And we'll say return song factory, convert song. Right, so I'm modifying my result.data. I could still return my result data. And we don't have song factory. All we need to do here is bring in song factory, in which case, if everything goes right, this should end up playing. You don't hear it because I don't want to hear these songs again, but you can sort of see. And again, that's a good chunk of the workshop. So what does the time on the board say for the lecture?
Started at 11:15.
All right, so we're a little bit late. We're going to start that at 11:30. I think at this point, I think the solution is already up. But I'll put up this video, which is going to be my face for the first half hour, and then the rest of it, and then we'll at 11:30 we'll go into the lecture on Angular directives.